Vladimir Putin has challenged the West to a ballistic missile duel just days after a top nuclear general was assassinated in Moscow, and North Korean troops have suffered dozens of casualties in Kursk. Kharkiv again. My name is Jerome. I'm the defence editor at the Sun newspaper, and this is Frontline, your weekly roundup of the most important news from the war in Ukraine. And this week we're also going to be doing an annual review of where we are now in this conflict in Ukraine. We start with the news that Vladimir Putin used his annual press conference, hours-long, highly orchestrated press conference in Moscow, to really lay down the gauntlet yet again to the West, but this time with an extraordinary challenge, a sort of off-the-cusp suggestion, almost the way it was delivered, that Western experts have proposed a duel between his new experimental Oreshnik ballistic missile and Western air defences. The message he was trying to convey was his missile is unstoppable. How dare you challenge me, threaten me, or support my enemy, Ukraine? That is what we're going to be discussing in detail in our exclusive members-only content this week. Is the Oreshnik medium-range ballistic missile really unstoppable? So if you're interested in that and you'd like to know more, then do join Frontline. You can now become a member of this show. Either there should be a link popping up now, it'll be at the end of the show as well, or you can go to the Sun's homepage on YouTube and you can become a member there for exclusive access to special content like that. You also get special badges and access to exclusive members only emojis, which you can use in the comments section. Helps us spot you, helps you stand out in that conversation below. And I'll say it again, if you've got any questions, comments, things you'd like to see more, do make them in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer them next week. As well as these threats from Putin, we've also had news this week of North Korean soldiers suffering very heavy casualties in Kursk. That is Russian Kursk Oblast, where they are fighting Ukrainian troops who seized a pocket of Russian land. Reports from various sources, including Ukrainian, including Russian military bloggers and British intelligence, all putting forward different numbers or no numbers, but the message being that North Korea has suffered serious casualties as they're thrown into battle in the sort of typical Russian style, these meat grinder assaults where huge numbers of people are killed and maimed in exchange for what Ukraine and Western officials describe as tactical gains. There are also unconfirmed reports, pretty gruesome unconfirmed reports, that the dead North Korean soldiers are having their faces disfigured to make them unrecognisable as North Korean casualties when they're moved backwards from the front lines. There have also been suggestions that perhaps some of these heavy casualties may not have been inflicted by the Ukrainians, but actually inflicted by the Russians as a result of friendly fire blunders. Now, that happens in every conflict, but it's especially complicated for the North Koreans and the Russians in Kursk because they do not share a common language and they haven't really trained together. In fact, they haven't trained together before these 11,000 North Koreans were deployed to Kursk Oblast to help Russia try and oust that Ukrainian contingent that seized ground. Now, because this is likely to be our last Frontline update of the year, I thought it was worth taking stock because, week by week we cover this conflict and sometimes we can lose sight of where things have got to. So this might be helpful for you. It's certainly been helpful for me to sort of pause and have a look at where we are. This time last year, I was reading the Institute of Study of War's campaign assessment, and they described Russia's main military objectives were to capture the rest of Luhansk district, continue to seize more territory in Donetsk, and also to generate more soldiers to maintain that fight. Ukraine's objectives a year ago were to survive, to repel, and to try and hamstring Russia's war machine by striking behind the front lines. Well, how has Russia gone about that objectives? Well, it's continued to try and grind down Ukraine on the battlefield, and I think outside of Ukraine it has tried to divide and intimidate the West. But ostensibly, they are still trying to achieve those same objectives that they were trying to achieve a year ago. They have had some significant successes, and we are not trying to downplay those. That has been bad news for Ukraine. Russia has made gains. In February of this year, they captured Avdiivka, That was the town that after they captured Bakhmut, they moved, their focus became Avdiivka. There was ferocious, very bloody fighting there. First time personally that a friend of mine, someone I'd met and befriended in the Ukrainian armed forces, was killed there. Then in May, we saw Russia launch a surprise attack into Kharkiv Oblast. So having been repelled from most of Kharkiv in the first autumn of the conflict, Russian forces massed in Belgorod, largely undetected, and managed to seize ground, particularly around Vovchansk. And they still hold a pocket of territory along the Russian frontier with Kharkiv. They continue to fight hard, these grinding, meat grinder offensives in Donetsk, and as of the time we're recording today, we believe they're around 3 kilometers now from Pokrovsk. That appears to be their objective. It's a major road and rail junction. They are fighting inside Korakove to the south of Pokrovsk. They've spent a lot of soldiers, a lot of resources getting there. They continue to advance steadily. These aren't lightning advances, but they are some of the fastest advances have been made in the last few weeks and months. Over the course of 2023, Russian daily losses appeared to average between 700 and 950 soldiers a day. That's dead and wounded. But this year, it's significantly more. It's up to about 850 to 1,500 a day. And actually, that average of 1,500 a day has been sustained for December, for November, and the latter part of October as well. So Russian casualties are massively increasing as a result of their increased tempo. The other big landmarks, I suppose, in Russia's campaign this year, in October, we saw the first deployment of North Korean soldiers from North Korea into Russian territory. And we've talked about how they are now fighting in Kursk. And of course, last month in November, we saw the first and so far only use of an experimental intermediate range ballistic missile, the Oreshnik, which was fired at the Yuzhmash, what used to be a missile factory in Dnipro, the central city of Dnipro. That was a sort of landmark moment. This is the weapon that President Putin claims is unstoppable. And he's threatened to use it again against decision-making centres, potentially a threat to Western embassies, a threat to President Zelensky's parliament, his government, and his offices as well. Throughout all of that, Russia has continued its ongoing campaign of massive drone and missile strikes, usually conducted at night, designed to cripple Ukraine's energy infrastructure. In the words of one Western official who was briefing on this week, they said the critical national infrastructure has shuddered, but it survives. It continues to operate, and Ukraine has had to put huge resources into keeping that going. Ukraine has not been, suffered. People have suffered power cuts, rolling blackouts, but the country continues to sustain, to withstand. Where was Ukraine this time last year? I mean, exactly this time last year, Ukraine was running out of weapons, running out of ammunition, because you may remember there was about $100 billion worth of US military aid blocked by Republicans in Congress. And there came a point where the fires ratio across the front line was around 10 to 1, or sometimes allegedly 13 to 1. So that's for every shell or mortar bomb or rocket that Ukraine could launch across the front line, Russia could launch 10 or 13 back in reply. According to one estimate recently, that ratio has now dropped to about 1.5, and we'll come on to one of the reasons for that in a second. It was this time last year that American officials were first raising concerns about North Korea sending military equipment to Ukraine. There were reports out of Washington that about 1,000 containers of North Korean equipment were being shipped to Ukraine. I mean, that has changed. There's not just 1,000 containers, there's 11,000 troops. The latest estimate from Western officials is that North Korea is supplying 3 million shells, artillery shells, to Russia a year. That's half Russia's annual supply. I've talked about how the death toll, the Russian toll of death and injured has dramatically increased over the course of the last 12 months. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte said just this week, that he now believes 1 million people have been killed and wounded on both sides of this conflict in Ukraine. Now, the UK has increased its estimate of Russian losses from 700 to 750,000. So just on a very crude kind of ballpark figure, that suggests to us that Ukraine has lost between 250,000 and 300,000 people, both dead and wounded, over the course of this conflict. So Russia's losses, a ratio of about 3 to 1. Russia's losing 3 soldiers for every 1 that Ukraine is losing, but nonetheless huge eye-watering casualties on both sides, and as I always say, a really grim reminder of the true toll of what is happening in this conflict. Quick run through some of the landmarks of Ukraine's 2024. They started the war, you may remember, with incredibly successful strikes against Russia's air force. Perhaps the most notable was when they shot down a Beriev A-50 command and control, sort of like a flying air traffic control plane. These are the aircraft that can sort of track the battle space, the battlefield, from an aviation point of view, detecting friendly aircraft, friendly air defense systems, and of course hostile threats. These are the very aircraft that are supposed to be very hard to hit because they can see everything that's coming from many, many, many miles away. Well, estimated value around $350 million. That was shot down over the Sea of Azov. Another one was destroyed a few weeks later. Ukraine has continued to make these sorts of high value strikes against Russia. By far and away, though, this year the most dramatic success for Ukraine was the August surprise invasion of Russian Kursk. Ukraine launched a lightning attack into sovereign Russian territory, which surprised many, well, certainly surprised Russia, surprised many of Ukraine's allies, and indeed many of Ukraine's own forces. No one really saw that coming, apart from the handful of soldiers who were involved. At its peak, they controlled perhaps just shy of 1,000 square kilometers of Russian territory. Since August, in the 4 months since August, Russia has been trying very, very hard to repel them. Ukrainian forces have been retreating. Latest estimate is they hold around 500 square kilometers, but they still cling on to this Russian territory. And President Zelensky has said that that is key. It's a sort of bargaining chip for future negotiations. And that's one of the things that's also changed, I think, over this year, is the language around the war. We've seen it from Ukraine, we've seen it from Ukraine's backers, particularly NATO Secretary General, indeed Britain's Prime Minister, talking about getting Ukraine into the strongest possible position for talks. After that August offensive into Kursk, we saw a phenomenal strike by Ukraine against an ammunition depot in Toropets. That was the one, there have been many of these long-range strikes, but that one really stood out. The explosions were so large, they were measured by seismologists as mini earthquakes. The Estonian Defense Intelligence Agency estimated that some 30,000 tons of Russian and North Korean ammunition were destroyed in those long-range drone strikes, and that's probably one of the reasons that the fires ratio has come down from 10 to 1 to around 1.5 to 1 currently on the front line. In November, America gave Ukraine permission to fire deep strike ATACMS missiles and British Storm Shadow air-launched bunker-busting cruise missiles into sovereign Russia for the first time. The ATACMS have a range of about 190 miles. The Storm Shadows have a declared range of around 150 miles. This enraged Russia, predictably, and it was what led to last month, the first launch of the Oreshnik missile. And most recently, just a few days ago, we've seen the assassination in Moscow of Lieutenant General Igor Kirillov. Now, he is the most senior Russian general to be killed on Russian soil since the start of this conflict. A couple of lieutenant generals, people of similar rank, have been killed sort of in Ukraine in the fight. Kirillov was killed by a bomb, explosives mounted or strapped to an electric scooter which had been left outside an apartment building in Moscow, a few miles from the Kremlin. He was killed with his aide, targeted assassination, a coup for Ukraine, which was claimed by Ukraine's SBU intelligence service. According to, that was sort of claimed unofficially, but through multiple intelligence sources suggesting that Ukraine's SBU were behind that. It's significant for a number of reasons. Kirillov will be replaced, unlikely necessarily to make any sort of major difference on the battlefield in terms of Russia's capability, but significant in instilling fear among the upper echelons of Russia's high command. Because if he can be killed in Moscow, outside his home, then who else is at risk? And hours before that assassination, Ukraine's SBU named General Kirillov as a suspect wanted in Ukraine for his part in the mass use of war crimes, the mass use of chemical weapons, which Ukraine described as war crimes. And these are primarily CS and CN gases, a bit like riot control gases, which Russian soldiers have been using to clear trenches. In summary, what we take from that is Russia continues to advance. We cannot, there's no denying that. There's no point pretending that isn't happening. Russia is gaining ground. Russia has the momentum, but it has certainly not been one where Ukraine is very much still in the fight. As we head into 2025, it seems that both sides now are trying to position themselves as best they possibly can for the talks, which appear to be increasingly imminent. And just a quick look from the international community's point of view, of course, there continues to be this looming uncertainty over how incoming President Donald Trump will treat this conflict. He's promised to end it within a day of coming into office. Other allies, particularly France and Britain, very vocal in wanting to stand with Ukraine absolutely as long as it takes. Prime Minister Keir Starmer talking about getting Ukraine into a strong position for talks. France and Britain both lobbying in different ways, or discussing in different ways, perhaps I should say, sending NATO troops into Ukraine to perform various support roles, training, maintenance of equipment, in order to free up the Ukrainian soldiers are doing that to get to the front. That is a recognition that the greatest shortage Ukraine is facing at the moment is men and women at arms. These eye-watering losses that both sides are suffering are hurting Ukraine more, not because Ukraine is suffering more losses, but because Russia is proving it can replenish the people it loses. Ukraine is struggling to replace people at the same rate it is losing them. And so fundamentally, while that may be a slow decline, it is ultimately unsustainable. And that is a concern, clearly a concern for Ukraine's allies. It's a concern for Ukraine, but it's being voiced more openly by Ukraine's allies. Finally, President Zelensky has said his position is, he says at the moment, he's acknowledged that at the moment Ukraine is not strong enough to regain the Donbass and regain Crimea. That isn't the same as giving up his ambition to retake them. He's just saying at the moment they're not strong enough to. He's also stressed that any peace talks would have to come with security guarantees. He wants Ukraine to get NATO membership. NATO remains lukewarm on that. There are, within the 32-member alliance, some are keen on it, but others are not, and it would require unanimity for Ukraine to join. If you've got any questions, please do ask them in the comments below. And remember, you can now join Frontline, and that will help us spot your questions. It will give you an extra badge, so we'll be able to spot you in those comments. It'll give you access to exclusive emojis to use in those comments. And of course, if you join the highest tier of membership, it'll give you access to exclusive members-only videos where we're going to answer the question, are Oreshnik missiles unstoppable? Last week's questions, run through these pretty quickly. Can you find out what Putin is doing on a daily basis? Is he in the Kremlin every day? Is he trackable? The short answer is no, we cannot track him on a day-by-day basis. There are periods when Vladimir Putin disappears from public view. That tends to prompt speculation about his health, whether he's disappeared, whether he's using body doubles. But he does, he makes regular public appearances, but his diary is not advertised long in advance. That's the same for many world leaders who employ use routine security protocols to keep themselves safe from threats. Very simple but important question. What do I think will be the outcome of the war? Well, at the moment, I think we are in the stage where both sides are maneuvering towards talks. But that doesn't mean I don't think there's suddenly going to be a ceasefire early next year and two sides are going to sit down at the table. These things take a long time, and armies will continue to fight. Unfortunately, soldiers will continue to kill each other even perhaps as talks are ongoing. There have been talks already in this conflict. Don't forget, there were negotiations at the very, very start between Ukraine and Russia, but they came to nothing. That was effectively when Russia demanded Ukraine capitulate, and Ukraine refused. In terms of understanding where the two countries are now, Russia remains sort of mixed messaging on whether or not it wants to negotiate. The suggestion from people who study President Putin and his aides very closely is that at the moment Russia is ready for Ukraine to capitulate, but Ukraine is not willing to capitulate. Russia is not ready for serious talks. And a final question, this was in connection to the sea drones we were talking about last week. You remember we talked about a drone which had a cannon mounted on it, which could with an AI computer, which could identify targets and engage targets independently. Somebody's asking, what about putting Stinger and a gun together? Well, Ukraine has already fielded drones with anti-aircraft missiles on its back. There's no reason to think that perhaps these vessels are not already operating together. I'm not sure whether it would be practical to sort of mount both on one of these Sea Baby drones, just because of the size of the drones relative to the weight of the guns and the missiles. What we've also seen, and perhaps I should have mentioned earlier, is the deployment of a sort of mothership vessel which has gone into the Black Sea, which can then launch first-person drones. Those are the kamikaze one-way attack aircraft. So this is a boat that goes out into the sea, launches quadcopter drones, which can then attack Russian shipping. So this kind of complexity, this evolution of using different types of drones together is already happening. Thank you for watching. If you've got any questions, do ask them in the comments below, and I will do our best to answer as many as we can next time, either on the show or I'll get into the comments and answer them there as well.